We face division in every part of our lives, within ourselves, within our relationships, and in our work. But it doesn't have to be that way. To live fully, we must integrate all that God has made us to be with the work He has given us to do. This is My Boulevard's Integrate podcast, helping churches, nonprofits, and everyday Christians identify the divisions holding them back and giving them tools to make lasting change.
Welcome to My Boulevard's Integrate podcast, where we talk about 7 core components of integrated disciple making. I am here with just, it's not just, but it is just.
Yeah, I mean, it's okay.
Amisho Lewis. It's exciting.
Once again, it's Baraka, sir. Amisho Baraka.
Amisho Baraka. This is it.
It's here.
Well, I am excited because, first of all, I've been dying for a long time just to have a Baraka Boys podcast.
You finally got it.
And today is it. This is it. Even though I miss my wife, I wish that she was here, but she is off taking kids to tour UGA. You know, it's when you have multiple kids, we are going to be graduating a kid for 7 years straight. You know, and next year is our next, and it's our youngest daughter, Briaya, and she's now touring UGA. So that's where my wife is. But that's not what we're talking about today.
Hold up. I'm struggling real quick. You have 6 kids, and you say you're graduating 7 years straight.
Yeah, because last year Angie graduated.
Oh, okay.
So there's 7 years straight. So she graduated this past summer with her master's in Christian counseling, or not Christian counseling, in counseling. And so that
filled in the gap.
That was the gap. That was the gap. And it was a very intentional thing because I was like, if you're going to be celebrated, we got to make sure you get in there where you fit in because we don't want you competing. We don't want you competing.
Got you.
So, but Amisho Baraka, what is today's topic?
Today we're going to be talking about multicultural discipleship.
Multicultural disciple making.
You have a seminar today that you'll be recording with Mark DeMoss about this very topic. So people, once they listen to this podcast, they can actually go and sign up on the city syllabus to listen or watch this particular webinar.
Yeah, and I think that is really good. But one of the first things because we were even debating about this, do we call this multi-ethnic disciple making or multicultural disciple making? Ultimately, we want to talk about the pros and the cons of it. But I wanted to first say, do you see their difference between multi-ethnic, multicultural? I know, connotative and denotatively. Denotatively, there is definitely a difference. But when people say the difference, do you think that they translate the same or something different?
No, I don't think. I think we use those words as proxies oftentimes to mean the same thing. But I do think there could be some. I mean, there are obvious inherent differences, but I do think they oftentimes can have distinguishable differeners. But I think even within, say, the difference between having an ethnic similarity and cultural, there could be people who have ethnic similarities but cultural differences.
Yeah.
And I oftentimes think we overlook that in a lot of our churches. You know, for instance, our church is very diverse here at Blueprint, but there's a cultural similarity for most of the people. Most of the people are college educated here. Most of them are middle class, or somewhere around that middle class to upper, maybe lower middle class area, and very urban. You know what I mean? No people are driving in from the country. You don't have folks walking in with overalls. So there are a lot of cultural similarities. Now, there will be subcultures within that, obviously, that create some distinguishable differences. But for the most part, there's a cultural similarity here at this church. So anyway.
Yeah, there's been lots of talks about this idea of, multicolored or multicultural because, even Brian Loritz, talked about the things as there could be different colors, i.e., racial groups, but they're one culture or different cultural groups or whatever. But, I just think that is important to, to distinguish the difference between multi-ethnic, multicultural, or especially given definitions.
Yeah, because, I mean, there are a lot of thriving so you can be very intentional about trying to be multi-ethnic, right? Because, you can drive in Atlanta, you can hit an Indian church, you can go to a Korean church, a black church, white church, right? But even within there, it's interesting because you can go to these all black churches or these all fill in the blank churches, but you'll find that even in there's usually like some a homogeneous culture, and even and this is why I say, even within a homogeneous churches, you can still practice minority homogeneous church. Let me say that you can still learn how to practice diversity.
Yeah.
So and discipleship can be also a challenge even within those spaces as well.
All right, so let's talk about this, because I want to know how nuanced, because this is always a nuanced conversation, and how nuanced can we get? So, for instance, would you consider just me and you multicultural, or would you say that we're the same culture? And how would you say where are the similarities and where are the differences?
Yeah, no, so that we could parse it out to like its finest extent, but I would say yes, we are the same culture.
Okay, because I think that's important, because I just remember like my wife one time was like, I don't feel like no one gets me, right? And then as we started talking, it was like, okay, Angie, now let me explain this. So you're saying basically there's no other person who's married to a pastor who has 6 children who's doing full-time ministry. Just like, there's probably like less than 1% of the world that is going to be able to get you. And I think oftentimes we go to churches trying to find people of our culture, same season of life, and so we end up saying, okay, here's the singles ministry, here's the married ministry, here's the young married ministry, here's the old married ministry, and so it's like when we think about culture, we can get so nuanced.
Absolutely.
And it's just like, and I think it's, to some degree, it starts creating even greater silos.
And that's I think that's an important point to make, because I think that's the greater problem with our politics and our sociology today, is that everyone is trying to create a protected class, if that makes sense. And so then identity politics, although I'm not here to disparage necessarily the idea of identity politics, but what happens is we all begin to try to find intersections that make us unique and separated from other people, and then you begin to create problems, because then you be like, oh, you're not like me, because then you like, oh, well, my race, my class, my physicality, my sexuality, all these things, and at some point you're like, well, you're looking for reasons to make yourself not identify with other people so that you can be special. And I don't think Jesus calls us to necessarily, or the scriptures call us to be colorblind in that sense, but it does say, look, the goal is to figure out our commonality versus trying to figure out how do we parse ourselves so that we can separate ourselves from community. If anything, acknowledge the differences and figure out where there's commonality within the culture. And so, yes, you and I could sit here and say, I love hip hop. You don't necessarily love hip hop.
I got my hip hop from you and Reggie. I mean, I'm just like, I tell people, I was predominantly an athlete that said, hey, what's the good hip hop?
Right.
And I'm so like, even now I tell people all the time, 98, that's when I left hip hop. But I still listen to it. But like 98 is when Biggie died.
Yeah.
And then Reach Records and Cross Movement became. I was just like, I became
years
lazy.
later, Reach Records, Cross Movement. Yes, don't try to.
Well, I'm saying it was 98. You guys are old now. You guys are no longer the young heads.
Yeah, we're not, but we're not that old. We're not Cross Movement old.
But it was just like, and so I got lazy. Right. And it's just like I stopped trying to follow the rap game, and then I just said, I'm just gonna follow the people I love.
Well, let me ask you this question then. So, in that, knowing that you've kind of departed from hip hop culture, and it's matured, it's evolved since the 90s. How does it impact you? How do you view discipling people, in a different culture, especially in the sense of like I believe you're responsible for what Reach and a lot of us are today. Despite if people give you credit, I'll give you flowers right now.
Oh, thank you.
However, what challenges are there to disciple people in different cultures for you?
Well, I mean, I think one of the scriptures that comes to me, first of all, and is something that has always stayed with me, is 1 Corinthians chapter 9, when Paul says, I become all things to all men so that I might save some. He says to the Jew, I become like a Jew that I might win the Jew, so on and so forth. Right. But he says to those under the law, I become as one under the law, even though I'm not without the law of Christ. Mm-hmm. Right. And then he basically goes on and just talks about, but what I love about that passage is twofold. One, he always understands his identity. He's not trying to become anything else, because he understands his identity. And so
identity as nationality, or what do you mean? Like
identity of who he is specifically. So like when he says, I become, even though I'm when I'm with those that are under the law, even though I'm without with the law of God. But he says, but those without the law, even though I have the law of love, the law of Christ. And so he says, so he recognizes, like, I'm not going to always, in my nuances, I'm not going to always be, but I understand who I am. And so I just take that as an overall. And so in the same way with hip hop, understanding that I never was kind of a hip hop head. I never was a hip hop head. I listened. I was there. I'm like influenced, just like most athletes that grew up in the urban context we were influenced. That's what was on my beats or on my headphones or whatever.
Because it definitely beats.
It wasn't beats back then, but that was on my headphones. It was definitely hip hop and all of that.
And your Walkman. That's what you just said.
Walkman. Yes, that is a true statement. But I was never a hip hop head. Right. So when early on, when like you guys, I was like, hey, what I can do is I can teach you guys Bible. You guys know hip hop way more than me, so I'm not going to try to become a hip hop head to just like and put the gospel in the hip hop form, because that's what you guys are going to be able to contextualize, because that's who you are, right? And so that's why for me, 90% of my, at least in the past, 90% of my illustrations all came from athletics, because that's what I was. I was an athlete. So I can make it indigenous to who I was based upon that. And so that's kind of like the nuance. And so when I think about cross-cultural, understanding who I was, but also understanding the context in which I'm trying to minister to, I gotta, that's where that dynamic plays. And I think that it's an important to recognize, because I know some people's like, yo, yo, yo. And then you get like the hip hop hands and, just like, it's just like,
So for to turn that into like the context in which we're in today, you recognize that you are of a certain, middle class, educated, but everybody in this particular space within a, whatever block radius, 8 block radius, is not educated, middle class. So how do you become all in that context? And for other people who may be listening, thinking like, man, I am of a particular subculture in the greater culture. How do I impact and disciple people?
Yeah, well, I think one, you first and foremost pull from your experiences. I mean, we grew up in a certain family. Like, one thing that people don't know about me and don't recognize about me is that, one, I have never ministered in a predominantly majority context. Never. Like, any context that I've ever ministered was in a majority context. Now, I have worked for majority, in a minority majority context. I'm sorry. In a minority majority context. Now, I have also worked, my adult life, I worked with Campus Crusade for Christ, but I worked with Impact with Crusade for Christ. I worked with Denton Bible Church, but I worked with Plumline and Lifeline for Denton Bible. I worked with the North American Mission Board, but I did Blueprint Church, or oversaw urban ministry. So I've always done ministry in the urban context. So the context is like I'm pulling from experiences, and a lot of it is I also pull from experience even pre-Christ. Like, we grew up in a middle class context, right? Middle upper class when Dad played football, right? But it was in New Orleans, which was all minorities. It was like, and so we lived. But then after that, we went to the other side. We was on welfare, right? And it was
Section 8 living.
Section 8, you know what I'm saying? And then we had the typical inner city kid story, right? And all that. But then we went to one of the safest neighborhoods in California, in Cheeto Hills, where the Ball Brothers.
Shout out to the Ball Brothers.
Shout out.
We trailblaze for them.
So we set it up for them. We set it up for them. So, I pull on those experiences that I have. And so, like, for me, I tell people all the time, I'm in the 4th Ward, which is the largest Section 8 housing in the city, but it's also the fastest growing gentrifying community. And I was like, I feel completely comfortable because I know what it's like to be in a variety of different contexts or whatever. So I do feel comfortable in a all minority context, but I also feel comfortable in a majority context in that way, because it's just the experiences that God gave me before I even thought about ministry, and all that. And so I oftentimes tell people, like, I live in a neighborhood that I feel like I was made for, right? And bringing these multi-ethnic, multicultural, and all these desires into kind of one. So I just think that is an important factor, is that you got to be authentically who you are and what you come from, and pull from that.
There's so much I want to talk about because this topic. So let me ask you another question. How does that what practical things does that impact as far as ministry doing a church and our doing life and discipleship in this context. You know, for instance, I'll give you just one example that I remember coming from Denton, Texas, and being, I guess you can say, a leader there in college ministry, and then moving to Atlanta, and expecting people just to have for instance, we would have Bible study at my house, and we would just, hey man, everybody, we're gonna go and do this at 7:00 on Wednesday. And I remember a brother walked up to me, he's like, hey man, like I don't have gas money to, I got either gas money to go to work tomorrow morning or to go and fellowship with y'all. And I remember that kind of like breaking my heart, thinking like, dog, how often do we create scenarios and spaces that may be challenging for people when we think everybody's living like us?
Yeah.
So how do you encourage leaders, thinkers, whoever's listening, to be all things to all people and consider how they even do ministry in a particular context where they may be a bridge builder like yourself in a space where there may be people on two different spectrums, and it's not always financial, but anything racial, right, etc.
Well, I would say the first principle that every disciple maker or missionary needs to go into any context, even your own context, even in your own marriage, your own home, is the principle of seek to understand before trying to be understood. Mm-hmm. That is just the number one thing that you need to go into, because oftentimes we go in speaking a lot, but answering questions that the people don't have. Right. And so you got to be able to seek to understand before trying to be understood. And then you can show how the gospel is an answer to that question. Right. And I think that is important, because the bridge building is about, we talk about Issachar lectures, or it's like people who understood the times, but then also knew what Israel should do. So that's the thing one. The second thing that I think we need to understand is recognizing that no matter what, you're not going to ever create a form of discipleship or call people to discipleship where you're not challenging them to change. And that means challenging them to get beyond just simply the norm or the cultural kind of things. And so what do I mean by that? I mean, like, when we were in the plumb line days, right? One of the things that I knew when a college freshman came in, whether they were church, non-church, or whatever, is that they were going to be challenged to adopt the practices of this culture. Mm-hmm. Because what I found is that if we try to do the opposite, where we try to create a culture like the community culture that's adapting to everybody else's culture, what you end up doing is satisfying nobody. Everybody's frustrated, and you're trying to meet everybody's nuance, right? We talked about it earlier, just like even as African Americans, we're not a monolith. There's so many different cultures, so many different backgrounds, so many different things. So to some degree, you have to create culture, right, in order to understand. And now you want the only major hindrance is the gospel, right? The gospel is offensive enough. So how do we invite people into relationships? And so that's really where a lot of times I'm principle based, in like what we're talking about. I say invite people into relationship and challenge them to change, right? And so I was like, don't invite people to time and space, but invite them into a relationship. And so if it's invited into a relationship, I need to know it's going to be a challenge for you to reprioritize your life to get a relationship with me. And I also need to reprioritize my life to be into a relationship with you. But if I'm calling you into a discipleship relationship, I think we need to do more of like a relationship of you need to, as the disciplee, come into my life versus me as a discipler going to your life, unless we are trying to evangelize, right? So if I'm trying to evangelize something, I need to make my way where they are, where the fish are. But if I am discipling someone as a convert into a kingdom builder, like they're already converted and they was like, I want to be discipled, they need to invite them into our lives. And so when Jesus was walking around, he says, follow me and I will help you become fishers of men. He didn't say, hey, let me come in. What do you need? What do you like? How can I make you better? How can I help you? No, that was Jesus. Like, I'm on mission. I've been given an assignment. And whether this season is a month, 2 months, or 3 years, come and join me in my assignment, and I'll help give you some stuff while you're in this assignment, while I'm in this assignment. And I think we need more of that, because people want father figures or older brother figures or disciplers, but they want them for their task and their assignment. And I just think that we got it all mixed up.
Christ is transforming. I think the one thing we all have to realize, though, is no matter how you disciple, you are, at best, you're inviting people in the kingdom, as you said, but the reality is you're inviting people into a particular type of culture. You're creating a culture, because we contextualize everything as people who are interpreting what Jesus says in our world and our understanding. And so it's okay, but as long as those things don't get in the way of gospel growth and kingdom building, is there any last tips or thoughts that you would give to people in this idea?
Well, I think we need to do a part 2 because I want to know what are the pros and the cons of that, and so let's end this one and let's pick it up with a part 2.
Let's go.
Thank you for listening to My Boulevard's Integrate podcast. Be sure to visit us online at myboulevard.co, that's myboulevard.co, or follow us on social media to stay updated on all things My Boulevard.